Alright, so today we are testing the RX 7600 in Robocop Rogue City. With the system I'm using today is a 12600K CPU, and that is paired with DDR4 3600 MHz CL18 memory. We're just at the start of a new campaign here. You'll see two numbers, don't get confused. On the left we've got MSI Afterburner, and on the right we've got the Radeon overlay. The Radeon overlay just displays the AFMF numbers. I do have AFMF enabled, so I do show both at the same time. So if you are not interested in AFMF, you can just focus on the numbers on the left hand side, and if you do like AFMF or you want to enable it, then just look at the numbers on the right hand side, as that is the frame rate that you'll be getting with AFMF enabled. Alright, it's just that MSI Afterburner does not pick up the generated frames by AFMF. Alright, let's just disable all that. Let's just go into the settings here. Currently we're at 1080p. I'll be testing at 1080p, 1440p and 4K. We're on the Epic preset, and we're just going to disable motion blur here. We do have high quality lumen reflections enabled. This doesn't make a difference at all to performance in the specific areas that I'm testing anyway. And we're just running at native resolution with TAA, right? So I'll just go into the building and we'll start the benchmark right from there. All right, but now in the building, and these guys don't mess around, so we'll just start shooting. So just one quick note about AFMF. AMD does recommend you get around 55 frames per second before you enable AFMF. That's true with most frame generation technologies. I mean, there's only two at the moment, but Nvidia DLSS frame generation, also you do need a pretty high base frame rate for AFMF2 or for frame generation to work properly. Otherwise the latency just gets in the way of having a good time, and also you do see some more artifacting. Alright, so I mean, inside we're not hitting 60 frames per second at all. I can't shoot. But you can see there with AFMF enabled we're getting around 120 frames per second, right? So it's basically doubling your frame rate. I don't know how they do it, whether I mean, some frame generation technologies, I keep on saying some, even FSR 3 and the DLSS 3 frame generation, it does have some performance over it. Even though every second frame is generated, it does have a performance penalty. So with the frame generation FSR 3 and DLSS 3, you don't double your frame rate. There's a performance penalty, right? So you get between 30 and 50% increase in your frame rate. Don't say performance increase, because that'll be incorrect. Right, but as you can see, I mean, inside we're getting around 60 frames per second. It's definitely not terrible, but it does dip below 60. When we go a little bit deeper into the building, it does dip below 50 even at times on the Epic preset. But then again, I don't think this GPU, it's an 8GB entry-level budget GPU, so it's not supposed to be playing at Epic anyway. Just a quick note on Robocop. This is a pretty good game. Like, there's a lot of discourse on it online. There's this is not a AAA game, and it's not trying to be a AAA game. It's just a first-person shooter with Robocop done pretty well. Like, if you keep that in mind, it's a throwback to the original Robocop from the 80s. I do land my headshots quite well now. Anyway, so a very good throwback to the Robocop games, or the Robocop movies from the 80s. And just keep that in mind when you play this game. Don't expect a AAA experience. It's getting close to AAA, but it's not there yet. But still a very, very good first-person shooter game. Alright, so getting around 60 frames per second here to 1080p on the Ultra preset or Epic preset. So we'll just go down into the building there, and we'll be playing with some settings. Alright, so just to give you an idea, the frame rate in this specific area is slightly higher, and then some areas it'll be slightly lower. So don't compare these results to the results in the beginning. I'm just playing through the campaign here, just to show what the experience is like. Alright, but that said, let's just move this over to the high preset. No upscaling just yet. Oops, that's the wrong button. Alright, so now we're on the high preset, and once again I'm just going to disable motion blur. Let's just do that. Let's just get all our numbers back up here, and it doesn't seem like we gained much, right? But as I said, the frame rate is very inconsistent in the different areas. Sometimes this will drop even into the 40s from what I've tested so far, and There are some cool mechanics in this game. Like it really is a very enjoyable first-person shooter, and it's not that expensive. If you do have a few bucks to spare, I'd highly recommend this game. But you can see there, I mean, it's dipping below 60 at times, so still not a solid 60 frames per second experience. And I'd say that that's my minimum requirement for a first-person shooter. Sure, with AFMF enabled, we're getting around 120 frames per second, 150. But the issue with AFMF is that it dynamically disables in fast camera motion, right? So if you are prone to motion sickness, just skip ahead. But I'm just going to move the camera quickly a few times, and you'll see that the frame rate in the top right hand corner actually drops, right? And that's just because AFMF disables frame generation dynamically, and that's where FSR 3 is actually better. That and FSR 3 is actually UI aware. So with AFMF, you'll get a little bit more artifacting when it comes to UI elements. All right, so that's it on the high preset. Let's move on to medium. All right, so on the medium preset, still all the settings are exactly the same. Sorry about that. And all right, let's see if we can maintain 60 frames per second now. All right, let me just get all the numbers back up and reset the numbers. So once again, we didn't gain much. I mean, sure, we were getting around 60. We're getting about 70 now. So not the biggest increase in performance when we changed the settings, but I did see in some areas the performance gains are definitely a lot more noticeable when you play around with the different presets. I did think that this Nvidia will be demonetized. There's a lot of blood in this game, but there's also quite a lot of enemies down here, so that will also explain the inconsistent frame rate when there's a lot of action on the screen. Like there was like one stutter there, you can see from the frame time graph. This game is actually pretty good when it comes to stuttering. In the open world outside, well, not really open world, but there is a little bit of a more open map just past this area. There is some traversal stutter that I've noticed. I mean, that's just Unreal Engine 5, but overall the game is pretty good considering that it's running Unreal Engine 5, right? So all right, I'm not going to be testing way too much here. Let's just drop this or put this back up to the high preset, and then we'll enable FSR 2. So this game does support TSR, which is temporal super resolution. Then we've got FSR, we've got XeSS, and we even have DLSS, which we can't select. All right, so we'll just go with the FSR 2.2 here. Not on the Ultra Performance preset. We'll just go with Quality, and as I said, we'll just go back onto the high preset and disable motion blur. Yeah. All right, let's just reset our numbers. Let's see if I can remember the combination. And now we're getting 102 frames per second. And if you do have a 240 hertz monitor, you have to enable AFMF because you'll be getting 200 frames per second, right? So that with AFMF enabled. Now, FSR does introduce additional like artifacting. You can just see there in the distance. Some edges are just a lot more pixelated. Some reflections just don't work that well. So I want to show you a quick trick. This is, I can't jump. Keep on forgetting. So you can actually grab these enemies and kill enemies with enemies. That's pretty cool, I think. Especially these guys with the head armor. Like you have to shoot them quite a few times before they actually die. Anyway, a lot of blood and gore in this game. So you can see here with the FSR enabled, FSR 2 on the quality preset, it's actually a pretty solid experience at 1080p for this GPU. All right, we're going to move on to the next area again, and we'll just be moving on to 1440p as we get down there. Right, so we're getting around 100 frames per second here. Just keep that in mind. Don't mind the lows. I mean, that obviously got broken now with the loading screens, etc. But getting around 100 frames per second between 90 and 100. So let's just move this over to 1440p and see what happens. First off, we'll just move back over to TAA. We'll enable or move up to 1440p and I think we'll start off on the high preset. I mean, it is the high preset just with the motion blur disabled here. So let's see how this goes. All right, so let's just reset our numbers. And now you can see we're getting around between 40 and 50 frames per second. And even with AFMF, even though it's a tech driver, like the game doesn't feel like it's doing 80 frames, 90 frames per second, right? Obviously, when you move the camera, as I said, it does dip below, or it does disable frame generation. And with a first-person shooter game, even a slower paced one like Robocop, it actually does happen quite often because, I mean, your Robocop moves pretty slow, but your mouse movements, etc., that's still like a normal first-person shooter. You need to be quite accurate, unlike me. But you can see there, we actually dropped into the 30s there. Once again, dropping into the 30s. Now, I do know some people don't mind playing at 30 frames per second, and that's perfectly fine. I personally just prefer 60 frames per second plus, especially for a first-person shooter game. And unfortunately, we're not getting that unless you enable AFMF. But once again, we're below that threshold that AMD recommends. Well, at 1440p, they actually recommend 70 frames per second before enabling AFMF, and we're well below that. And it's definitely very noticeable in the input latency. Yeah, it's not a good experience. And now when you move the mouse a lot quicker, it actually does, it becomes jarring, like, because AFMF gets disabled. I ran out of bullets there. AFMF gets disabled, so like there's a lot of jarring effects going on. The frame rate is quite high, and then all of a sudden it's low, and the input latency actually feels better when it disables, so the mouse is a lot more responsive, and then it gets enabled again, and then it's dragging about. I don't know. This is not the best use case for AFMF. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah. All right. Let's see what we need to do to get 60 frames per second here at 1440p. I actually think if we just enable FSR on quality on the high preset here, I think we should be able to maintain 60 frames per second, right? Maybe not maintain it, but it's getting quite close. So let's just refresh our numbers. They'll reset our numbers and pick up some ammo. And let's see, this area actually does perform slightly better than the previous area. You can see you're getting around 75 frames per second here, dipping in below 60 even. So, I mean, dipping into the low 50s there. So, all right, so the high preset is definitely still not getting us 60 frames per second. So let's just go onto the medium preset here, and hopefully that sorts it out. All right, so the medium preset here, let's see. If we refresh our numbers, I'm pressing the buttons, but nothing's happening. All right, there we go. This is a 60% keyboard, so I do struggle with that combination. Sometimes I have to press Alt and page up, but for this, I have to press Alt and function and Shift and page out. I don't know. It's just a mess. Anyway, we're going to breach here, I think. But before we do that, let's just complete the benchmark rundown here. Now you can see there is some additional artifacting here. It doesn't look and feel smooth. Don't mind the screen tearing. The capture card actually records screen tearing as well. One cool thing about this game is the destructible environments. Not all objects are destructible, but these pillars are pretty cool. It's reminiscent of the Matrix. Anyway, so getting around 75 frames per second here, and then 120. Well, there we go, back to the 2 times FPS increase here with the AFMF in the top right hand corner there. So this is actually not a bad experience. I'd suggest maybe not using AFMF in this game. Just try and get a higher base frame rate, because the AFMF being disabled and enabled all the time, that's just pretty jarring, especially on a first-person shooter game or in a first-person shooter game. All right, that's it for 1440p. Let's move on to 4K. All right, so now you can actually see just in the menu, there's a lot of artifacting, UI artifacting, and that's just AFMF, all right? This happens with the DLSS 3 frame generation as well. Not whilst you're standing still in the menu, it has disappeared now, but AFMF is not UI aware, so it would be more noticeable with AFMF, but anyway, so we're on the medium preset here, and I'll just disable FSR just to give you a baseline performance here. Don't expect anything good. Yeah, this is not the best experience. I've tested it before, so I actually recorded this video, and then my mic was turned off. I recorded 40 minutes and no voice input. Now you can see we're getting 25 frames per second. Now this is not a 4K GPU at all, but now the input latency is horrendous, because our final output there is 50 frames per second. That's not what you should be aiming for when you use frame generation. You should be aiming for a high refresh rate experience. Don't expect it to magically transform your experience into a 60 frames per second experience, and it'll be a good one. it's not. Any frame generation tech at 60 frames per second is it's horrendous when it comes to input latency. This just feels terrible. I just want to show you before we go in here, getting 25 frames per second, definitely not ideal. And we did have a few major stutters there, and our 0.1% closer sitting at 8 frames per second. Anyway, so let's see what we need to do to get 60 frames per second base at 4K. Alright, so I went as aggressive as I can on the upscaling. We're at Ultra Performance, so this means the game is now rendering internally at 720p. On the medium preset, I don't think going down to the low preset would help us much, but I mean, let's just see how this goes. And as you can see, we're not hitting 60 frames per second even with Ultra Performance. Now, FSR also has a performance penalty. Now there's just a lot of screen tearing, right? Because the capture card is 60 hertz, so I mean we're getting very close to that. So it drops below it, and VRR is disabled because the pass through monitor just doesn't work when the VRR is enabled through the capture card. Anyway, close to 60 frames per second is pretty much the best you can do here at 4K. So let's just they're killing all the hostages. I'm trying to concentrate on the benchmark numbers. So this is not how I would play this game. You can just see in the cutscene as well, the frame rate does drop. I'm just going to skip this, no spoilers. And let's just refresh our numbers here quickly. So down here, we do get just above 60 frames per second. So if that's what you're aiming for, I'd say that's the minimum aim you should be going for anyway in a first-person shooter game. And no diss to anybody who likes to play at 30 frames per second. Once again, it's just personal preference. It's quite dark in here. So Ultra Performance, you'll see now that it does have quite a lot of issues actually. I mean, it'll make sense because it's a very aggressive upscaling now from 720p up to 4K. So there's just a lot for the upscaler to do. So it'll just make sense that there is a lot of artifacting, like especially in these reflections. You can just see moving reflections, and FSR at Ultra Performance just does not agree with it. All right, so we're not getting 50 frames, we're not getting 60 frames per second, but we're not getting 50 frames per second either in some cases. So let's just see if we drop this down to the low preset, if it actually helps. I actually don't think it will. Is there an ultra low? No. So all right, so low is as low as it can go on the presets. Don't think there's much you can disable here more. Let's just disable that as well. And this doesn't have much effect on performance anyway. So let's just see. I mean, it's still dipping below 60 frames per second. So just avoid 4K with this GPU. Once again, it's not a 4K GPU, so this was just to see how it'll do at 4K. I think 1440p is actually a pretty decent experience, especially when you use FSR Quality, and 1080p. Well, you saw what we did there with FSR at 1080p as well. As I said, I probably wouldn't recommend using FSR at 1080p, but if you do want a higher frame rate, then it's absolutely necessary. But the game does look a lot darker now than it did earlier. I don't know, there's still some issues with this game. I couldn't change resolutions earlier. I had to restart the game just for resolution changes to take effect. It's very dark in these areas now. So it's like the lighting, and probably it's because it's on low, right? The lighting doesn't load in unless you are close, because I mean there's a light there, but it's not creating any light. As you move closer, you can actually see the lights. All right, so low is not how you should be. I mean, just look at the light pop in here. Don't use low, don't use 4K with this GPU, if that wasn't obvious before. Alright, so that's going to be it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.